I don't know how to describe it other than like a demon type of sound.
But it's silhouetted, hulking, every bit of 5.5 feet wide, 13 to 14 foot tall, pitch black.
The one thing that ran through my mind when I had this encounter was I don't have a big enough gun.
Your host, two-time witness and field researcher for more than 40 years, William Jevning. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Welcome to the Q&A, everyone. Milo called me earlier and said he's not feeling well, so he's not going to be on with us today. And we just found out that Forrest is sick as well, so she won't be with us today either. But Tom, would you like to introduce Jeff?
Yes, absolutely. We have a very special guest today. This is Jeff. And for those of you who listen to the midweek show, Bigfoot in History, Jeff is the guy that does the narration on that. And I'm going to let him fill you in on what his professional background is. But before we get going, I just want to say thank you to everybody for your excellent questions. You keep the topic alive and going. And also, if you like the show, let us know. Send us a like and subscribe and share with your friends. And if you want to support the program, you can do so. We've got a link in Patreon. And we'll be posting a shout out to all of our latest Patreons. So with that said, I'm going to hand this off to Jeff. And Jeff, tell us a little about yourself and both your background with audio and what you're currently doing.
I was going to ask, when you say professional background, which one do you mean? Because there's too many.
All of them.
So I have experience from years ago in radio and audio production, things like that, and just enjoy doing it more or less as a hobby these days. But we had gotten together through mutual contacts because I was looking for a place to just do some audio recording and kind of get my feet back into that world. So this has been a good opportunity for me to do that, and I appreciate it. My full-time gig, my full-time job most days is in ministry. So I serve as a pastor in North Dakota. I'm way up here. I've been in ministry since my late teens. So 20 something years now. I've lost track. I think it's up to almost 25 years. No, it's longer than that. It's coming up on 30.
We're not holding you to ages or anything like that.
It's been a while, but no, I do a few other things too. I just side projects and things, but I really enjoy audio work. And like I said, I've been in radio a couple of times. I did radio in college. I worked in radio full time for a short period of time in those early years when my oldest was a baby, really, and just kind of miss it. I enjoy playing with audio equipment, and I've been a sound guy even in church since I was like a 7th grade or something. So that's kind of my background.
And your academic background is have just completed, or you're in the process of completing your doctorate?
I am just on the last part of it. I am about to enter what they call the dissertation and project phase, which is probably the busiest point of it. So I'll be doing it's on leadership. So I'll be doing my project on developing leadership training system for our pastors here in the Dakotas, and also just a lot of writing is going to be involved. So I finished all my classwork, all of my classes, including one. I just wrapped up one on theories of learning and principles in higher education. I think that's the right name for that class. I never get it right. But so I'm finishing up the doctorate. I've got a Master of Arts in religion and a Bachelor of Science in religion as well prior to that. So.
Okay. And you and I talked a while back. It was just fascinating. It has nothing to do with Bigfoot, but some of the brutal academics requirements. One of the guys you're talking about, one of the instructors would give you a verse, and I believe you had to write down 10 or 20 questions, and you come back the next day and what are 10 or 20 more?
Yeah, that was in my undergrad work, and then the class prior to this one, we had to take just a couple of verses in Romans and and dissect them down to the level of writing what amounted to about a 25-page paper on it. So I'm familiar with the deep dive concept and research. I've learned a lot on that front.
Well, that kind of dovetails into, and you've been doing the last 17 chapters on Ivan Sanderson's books.
Yeah, I think I started on chapter 3.
Okay, that's right. Okay,
I didn't start right at the beginning, but I picked up about chapter 3 or maybe chapter 4. So I've been through most of the book at this point. And it's been fascinating. I really enjoy Sanderson's style and the way he digs in and does his research. And when I think we'd had one conversation ahead of chapter 17 because you told me some of what was coming in, and so then I kind of read ahead, which I do a little bit anyway. But I read ahead and looked at it and was like, okay, well, yeah, this is interesting. This is curious. There's a couple of places in the chapter where I was like, I wasn't sure how to say it, but it's like Sanderson does a really good job of digging into the data and kind of like, I think he calls himself a journalist. I don't know if that's his first profession as a journalist, but he talks about his journalistic kind of curiosity. And there's a couple places when I was reading this chapter, I was like, he just quotes, I can't remember the guy's name now.
It was a friend of his. It was a Jewish scholar.
Ibn Aaron. Yeah, he quotes a pretty long block from him, but doesn't really do anything else to the text there. And it was stuff in that block that I was like, I don't know much about this other guy. I've never really heard his name. I kind of Googled him and read a couple things about him. I Google a lot while I'm reading because I'm trying to, get pronunciations right as much as possible. And there's probably listeners who go, well, you messed up a few. And I don't doubt that I did. But there were a couple of things that Aaron quoted in that block text. And I tried to Google one of them and I can't find a thing for it. So it's like, I don't even know where it came from. But I get interested in this kind of stuff. So then I go digging and like deep diving. And I think at one point when I was just we'll call it researching for fun because I'm interested in all of this. I probably had like 20 tab windows open with the different stuff I was trying to search and connect and double check and, doing my own version of Sanderson, I guess. But
one of the questions that I wanted to kind of bring up, and we'll mention this in the intro, and that is Sanderson made a distinction between, correct me if I'm wrong, Will, because I haven't read chapter 17 yet in its entirety, but a distinction between the Nephilim, which was a biblical, I don't know, Jeff, I'm going to have you explain what the Nephilim is, versus Bigfoot, and he made a clear distinction between those two. Did I get that right, Will? Yeah,
he actually, it was his friend, the Jewish scholar, and I believe it was from Jewish commentaries, and I'm not sure how all that works, but I'm sure they go into depth with a lot of things that aren't in, the Bible or I can't think what the name of the book is they use, but
the Mishnah, the Talmud, there's a lot of different Jewish writings,
right?
And he quotes. One of them he mentioned was Leviticus Rabbah. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. No, go ahead.
Like I said, I got to dig and I was fascinated, but I couldn't find the quote that he quoted from Leviticus Rabbah in any of the translations I have. Now I know the guy was a linguistic scholar, so maybe he did his own, but I couldn't find anything even close to it. And I was like digging because it was interesting.
Well, it was interesting how they highlighted the difference when they talk, because everybody out in the world today says, that's interested in the subject says, these are the Nephilim, and it's not. It's clearly not from what he said, because he talked about the Nephilim would have actual beds with an actual measurement. I think it was 18 feet. So they weren't something hairy out living in the forest. But later he did talk about that, and I think there were actually two different names they used, and they translated into the hairy ones and mighty ones of the hunt, and apparently they plagued the Jews after they fled Egypt for years.
Well, and the interesting thing for me about the hairy ones is because, and one of the things I like about what he quoted from the rabbi there was, Hebrew is a language that's just built for wordplay. You can do all kinds of things because there's no vowels. And words that sound alike and are spelled the same, and you can have all kinds of fun with them. But at the same time, it can also lead people down weird paths. And there's in Hebrew, like study, they talk about 5 levels of understanding for the Bible. So you have like the plain surface meaning that's right there. Then you have kind of the like hidden meaning where you dig into like these word plays and these other things. And you have what they call midrash, is where you try to make like connections between things to derive principles. And then they have what they call the secret meaning, and then the uber secret meaning, like the secret of the secret. And guys like the Zohar, who are quoted in this chapter, do a lot of that secret of the secret type of stuff. They're known for being just straight up mystics at times, you know. And the idea, though, is the thing about the hairy ones that I found interesting in here, and I was trying to, this is one of the things that drove me to kind of do some more reading, was, so Esau's name, and Esau's mentioned in here, Esau's name means like hairy, you know. He's like, what a nickname. I don't know how hairy he must have been as a baby, but he's called hairy right out of the womb. And the other one is red, or Edom, like ruddy. And in the biblical text, these words kind of get interchanged. And then what happens on top of that is Esau's descendants move into the area around Mount Seir, and Seir is the Hebrew word for hairy, but it's understood to be a mountain of some sort, or a mountain range, kind of where, like if you're familiar with Petra, you know, the area where they filmed the last crusade for Indiana Jones, that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah.
It's in that area of the world, in that kind of deserty sort of thing. And so I saw what he did with the word hairy ones, but it might as well just be like descendants of Esau. And honestly, that's kind of the biblical narrative. The descendants of Esau are kind of at war with the descendants of Jacob, you know, the Israelites, because Jacob is Israel. And so there's a brotherly war that translates down through their generations. And it so happens, you know, Esau's people get, both because his nickname was hairy and because his name means hairy, so all of his descendants, called Edomites or Seirites or whatever, any of those things, would typically come across. You can translate as hairy ones, but I thought that maybe that was a stretch to say that everybody descended from Esau was a big, you know, like some kind of hairy being.
You know, it's interesting though, you mentioned hairy and red. You know, these creatures are typically reddish brown in color.
I had read that in previous chapters.
Yeah, whether that has any bearing, but it is kind of an interesting side note.
It is. I was fascinated too, because one of the things that Sanderson touches on all the time is kind of the geography and the climate, if you will, like the overall climate, and the area around there. Like, I've been to Israel. I've not been over toward like Petra in that area, but the area of that landscape is very much desert and it would be very unhospitable to what he typically sees these creatures inhabiting. So I didn't know how he would reconcile that. He doesn't really touch on it that I remember.
You know, I'll tell you something though. We have a current very active site in Arizona, of all places.
Yeah, that would be a similar geography type of, or climate. There's another word he uses for that, and I can't remember it now. But yeah, and I was fascinated by that, and just the idea, you know, trying to connect all the pieces across there were interesting to me, for sure.
Jeff, let me ask you. There's, you know, we talked a little bit about the Nephilim. You know, they're definitely not Bigfoot, but the Nephilim weren't the only. I guess you just call them giants. Wasn't there something else called Raphaim? And I'm struggling now. I think there's a Raphaim, and there's another group that was the Anakim, maybe. I don't know. Can you comment on that?
Oh, the Anakim. Yeah, I think and I'm not looking at anything off, so this is off the top of my head, but the Anakim, if I'm remembering right, are what supposedly like Goliath and his family were like the descendants of Anak. When the Israelites were getting ready to go back in the Promised Land, you know, they sent spies into the land, and the spies came back and reported, "Hey, there's really big guys there. You know, there's like giants. We don't want to go in there." And of course, Goliath, according to the Bible, if you figure out Goliath's height, I did this once for kids on like a VBS thing. We made a life-size replica height-wise. We couldn't do a lot more with it, but supposedly Goliath was 9'9". That's not tiny, and and supposedly he had 4 other brothers that were equally large. And I don't know
Well, I'm
where
not
they
good at
fit.
math, but 9.9.
9 foot 9 inches tall.
Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely above like the tallest NBA players we have currently. And we do see some really tall guys, and there are also, like there's people even modern who get excessively tall, whether it's because of a condition or whatever. So, I mean, I think a lot of people speculate about Goliath because it's him and his family, but there apparently were other giants in the land too. Like I said, the Anakim, if I remember it right off the top of my head, were the ones that were considered the giants when the spies went in and said, we don't want to mess with these guys. We'll stay out here in the desert. It's actually kind of what they were saying. It's better out here. But in the end, they go in and take over the land, of course, according to Judges, really is kind of the story of that. So.
Well, and what I found interesting was there was one of those, and I think it was Anakim, but correct me if I'm wrong, a Kingogg who was absolutely huge. I mean, he was even gargantuan, I think, by Goliath. I mean, wasn't his bed came out to like 13 feet or something, or am I?
Oh, I would have to look that up. I recognize his name, but I don't remember those details. Like, I don't remember the specifics.
He was big. He was real big.
There were some really big guys, I mean, there were. And the Nephilim, to go back to that point, that's a place where a lot of scholars just kind of throw up their hands and go, we don't really have a good answer. We know, what the text says, but there's not an elaboration on that. You can find a little more, and I know that, Sanderson quoted that about because people would fall down. I think that was the Rambam or somebody who was one of those Jewish rabbis who had said that in his commentaries, that's what that really meant, that the idea of the Nephilim was just somebody, they'd fall down on their face in front of them.
Yeah, and I think I read some literature on that as interesting as that is, it means to fall. It according to this guy, gentleman named Dr. Heiser, who said that it doesn't really hold up, and I don't remember the exact arguments why, but he said really they really were giants. These things they're big. They're called giants for a reason.
Yep. Yeah. I believe, that there were definitely some giant guys. The text is pretty straightforward about that. So you don't even have to do wordplay at that point. That's on the plain surface meaning.
I had no idea that there were, what did you say, 5 potential meanings or 5 definite meanings of.
Yeah, that's it's like, I tried to pull it. So I tried to pull something so I could see them because I would mess up the words, but the words in Hebrew, they have pashat, which is the straight meaning, and then remez, which is the secondary meaning, like the hints and allusions in the text. They call drush or midrash. That's when you like pull out moral meanings and things like that. And then sod is like secret, and then they have sod of sod, which is really secrets. So that's typical Jewish like theology, is you have all these different levels of meaning potentially within the text. And obviously, most Christian scholars would prefer to stay right on the top level, which is the pashat, the basic plain meaning. They'll occasionally go into that secondary level, of like looking for hints in the text and things like that. Obviously, we as Christian scholars would pull a lot of like the third level too, which is the kind of moral principles and things like that. But very rarely does any Christian commentator want to deal on the like secret hidden stuff or anything trying to dig into that. It could tend to get a little weird, if you do that. So
is it kind of a little bit subjective to the reader's interpretation, or?
Yeah, it's very subjective when you get into that level. And I'm not saying no Christians do that, but it's just considered very mystical would be the best English word for us. It's like the mystics of the Jewish faith sort of thing. I'm really intrigued a lot of times with digging at the second level, where you find little things in the text that hint at deeper meanings. And it's one of the reasons why I'm still trying to learn Hebrew better. I know a little bit. I always say I know enough to be dangerous, and potentially make a mistake. But I like digging into those little word plays that are in Hebrew, because there's so many of them. And there's no way to translate a word play in English or anything. You just have to be able to see it in the text for what it is. So,
one of the things that I'm curious, and I don't know if you got into this in any of your studies, but ancient Mesopotamian writings, cuneiform and that sort of thing, Gilgamesh and all that, which had some sort of parallels to the Genesis flood story, but it was definitely different. Have you studied any of that? And do you have, because there was I briefly read where I think Gilgamesh had a companion, a hairy friend that was, for all intents and purposes, sounds like he had a friend that was a Bigfoot.
Was Grendel, wasn't it?
Well, Grendel is the Scandinavian guy, but this one actually goes back to ancient Near East, kind of like, well, pre-flood, I think. I don't know. I'm scrambling for words here. Jeff, any thoughts on this?
I'm not familiar as much with the specifics of that one, but in general, like the kind of parallels that you see across a lot of ancient literature help point back to some real common source material for the story itself. There's really fascinating stuff across multiple cultures, because you've got, like, I've seen some stuff on the Chinese language where the Chinese pictographs represent things that you see in Genesis, like salvation, I think, is like two people in a boat, basically, or something like that. And stuff that recalls like the Noah story and things like that, that are like embedded within the Chinese characters, which is fascinating, because you think about that, it means that the culture itself, like these stories are based on real things. This is a real truth that underlies it, and it translated through oral tradition and oral memory until it was able to be written down. And of course, like from what we can tell, a lot of parts of the Old Testament, are some of the oldest writing anywhere. So they were the earliest committed to memory.
That's interesting.
To paper.
I've read sometime back, and this I wish, unfortunately, Forrest was, she's taken ill. So, we hope she gets better, like, as soon as possible. But her and I were talking the other day about some of the indigenous people in northeastern Russia, Siberia, that are, for all intents and purposes, they look like what we would consider to be the Eskimos of Alaska. Probably are. I'm sure they came across the land bridge. But in this article that I was reading, and we were talking about this, is that their lineage, their DNA, I think, was actually traced back to Turkey. So if we have any anthropologists out there, if you want to get a hold of me and tell me I'm totally wrong, I'm fine with that. But I thought it was interesting that, okay, so they came from Turkey and then crossed the land bridge, and then, we have all the various Native American tribes that kind of came down. So I'm going, Turkey. Seemed like there was a big boat at one time in Turkey, right?
There was, yeah. That's where it supposedly came to land. Somewhere in the Turkish mountains.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just find that interesting. That, I don't know, Will, did you, in any of your anthropology studies, did you guys get into that at all, or did you study any of that?
No, I was more physical anthropology.
Okay. Digging in the dirt and getting the bones and that sort of thing.
That's it.
That's the fun stuff. But yeah, anyway, I found that interesting because it makes a connection to, and I don't know if there's any stories in the Native American lore of, big flood and all of that. But I'm interested that you said there was something like that in the Chinese culture.
Yeah, I wish I could remember the specific characters that I'd read about. I'd read this in a book one time about different Chinese characters that had tie-ins with things from the Genesis account, the creation account, including the flood. Early Genesis stuff. I'd be fascinated now to go back and look if there's a word for giant, what that comes across as in Chinese. I'm sure there has to be one.
Well, they do have in China. Well, I think it's probably more in Western China. They have their own Bigfoot. It's called the Yeren, I think.
Yeah, that's one of. There's actually. Let me think. I think there's two. And again, that's in Sanderson's book too. He distinguishes between the two.
Yeah, I remember reading some of the Asian stuff. I've been really fascinated with Sanderson's stuff too on anthropology in particular, and like his observations. Obviously written in like the 50s and 60s in a time when people weren't trying to be as politically correct. He says some things that would come across to a modern listener as probably rude, I guess, but the observation itself is really correct. I mean, he's making accurate observations of what he sees and
you have to look at
it to us.
And you have to look at the time period. There are different terms and things used in the 50s than there are today, obviously.
Oh yeah. But even beyond the language, just sometimes it's people are so careful about not wanting to say, well, this is what this is, or this looks like this, and this leads to this, and that Sanderson in this chapter, in chapter 17, he talks about the different like kind of overall, I don't know if you'd call them races, but like Mongoloids and Negroids, Caucasoids, and how they interact and like how their characteristics flow through successive generations, and like which ones the characteristics flow through more, like which are more dominant. He goes through this whole little bit on that, and I was fascinated reading it because on just a sheer observational level, it's kind of obvious, but you don't hear people talk about things like that typically anymore. It's become so politically incorrect to just observe reality sometimes and note what's really there.
I'm just going to throw a question in here real quick, and I want to get back to our current discussion, but Will, we have one of our listeners out there who wants to know if there's any reports of, if birds travel in flocks. You have a murder of crows, deer and elk gather in herds. What would a group of Sasquatch be called? He says group sounds very bland.
Well, that's for the scientific community to figure out once, they are proven to be real. But I suppose you'd have to look at other large primates and see how they're grouped. What do they call a group of gorillas or chimpanzees, etc.
Okay, so that's a good point.
I mean, how do you list a group of people?
Depends who the group is.
That's true.
What do you call a group of chimpanzees?
Well, that's a good point. I don't know offhand.
I don't either. We'll have to ask Forrest when we get her back. But so getting back to Sanderson's book, and he makes the clear distinction between Nephilim and Bigfoot. Jeff, what and he was quoting a rabbinical scholar, right? Or a friend of his. Yep. That was a rabbi. Are there any other, I'm just curious if there's, and this is something that has kind of been a question of mine for a number of years, because, we have, Neanderthal came up through, there's a time when Neanderthals were in the Near East. And I'm just curious if there's anything that you've heard of in either ancient Near East text, lore, legends, what have you, or Jewish texts or legends that would talk about some other type of creature like a Neanderthal or even a Bigfoot, besides the Nephilim and Anakim and that sort of thing.
I can't think of any off the top of my head. One of the things I've got on my Kindle for reading that I'm still digging through is there's a whole series of books called Legends of the Jews that is very much extra biblical. It talks, goes through a lot of the biblical kind of account of like the different main characters, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, all those guys, and kind of tells all these extra stories about them. Now, I haven't gotten through very many of those. You can find them online too, I think, and kind of search them out, but they were free downloads on Kindle. But I'll kind of keep my eyes open now. I've never really kind of looked for them in there before, but I am curious.
With ancient peoples too, it's instructive, I think, to kind of think about how maybe they would have worded something. It might not be as blunt as we would today, in terms of, where's this big hairy creature? They may have used something completely different that would be easily overlooked.
Yeah, there was something I noticed in this text too, when he was talking about the hairy ones, and he brought up the idea of the scapegoat and kind of tried to tie it to like these hairy creatures, as if there was a sort of humanish quality to the hairy sacrifice that Aaron did. And that was one of the points where I was reading it, and I remember kind of looking at the text going, because that particular ritual that he's referring to is something that the Jews do all have. Well, they don't do it now because the temple doesn't stand, but they did it from the time of Aaron all the way through the time of Jesus and about 40 years beyond, because that's their Yom Kippur, the traditional thing. They have two goats. They have the one, and he mentioned the Azazel thing, which Azazel is a really obscure term. Like that's literally the only place it's used in all of the Bible. And it's kind of, it's like doing a lot of linguistic digging to try and get a good word for what that is. Most people think Azazel refers to like some kind of demigod or deity or potentially, like a demonic thing, like a fallen angel. But Azazel is the inscription that's given to the scapegoat, the one that they take, like the lots are cast, and then they take the one goat out into the wilderness. And according to Jewish tradition, they throw it off a cliff because they don't want to risk it coming back. It's the one carrying all the sins for the year, so it's got to go. And there's a lot of interesting like Jewish history built up around that. And so seeing Aaron, Ibn Aaron, I think that's his name, take it on this different track, I was like, I'd never seen anything like that before, and I'm not really sure that it's on the level, so to speak, or maybe it's just kind of fanciful thinking, because really the ritual he's talking about is something that's really well known and that was done in practice even into, I don't know if we can call the time of Jesus modern times, but it's current enough that we've got a lot of data around it. So it's like that one. The other stuff about the hairy ones further back made more sense, but trying to tie that one into the lore of it was probably the weakest point of what I saw in his case, like looking down there. And then he quoted the Zohar, so that he went completely full mystical at the end of that. But there's some really interesting stuff around the scapegoat. It probably gets off of our track of the subject we're on, but there's some stories about the scapegoat and the rituals they would do even in the time of Christ and beyond it, like in the late first century, from about 30 to 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed and they no longer did the sacrifice. There were some rituals they would do. They would have a red rope that they would tie on the scapegoat, and they would also keep one on the door of the temple. And supposedly, according to tradition, when the goat would die, the rope would change color. And then in 30 AD, the rope stopped changing color. And you can actually see this in the Jewish literature. If you Google it, you can even see it. So this was like, they knew what they were doing, and then something changed there. And of course, Christians have their understanding of that. But it speaks right into that ceremony and the fact that they were really using actual goats and not some odd hairy creatures. So just wanted to
Yeah,
throw
I
that
was-
in there.
I thought that was interesting. And you actually answered one of the questions that I had, and that is if you could kind of describe a little bit of the ritual, with the two goats. But you kind of went into it. One thing that you and I talked about with the two goats, and it sort of amusing, is one of the goats they want to make sure does not come back.
Yep.
Yeah. So they would make sure it doesn't come back. So here's a question that's kind of related to this, and then I'm going to follow up with another one. I think in at least one place, maybe a couple of places in the Old Testament, I think Daniel uses the term watchers. And do you have any understanding of that? And can you explain kind of what the meaning of the watchers were?
I think I would be dropping into some real speculation territory now, but I'm familiar with the concept. Yeah. And I think in English we've pulled out this, there's a phrasing we use, who watches the watchers. But there's a real concept within scripture of what we can't see, as opposed to which this was something else that was in this chapter too that really fascinated me, because he talks about, and maybe in the chapter before this, he talks about the fact that uncorporeal beings, spiritual beings or whatever, if you will, don't leave physical evidence as a general rule. And so there's a real acknowledgement within the Bible that there is a world beyond what we can see, things that we can't necessarily put physical constraints on, if you will, for evidence or things. And I think the watchers, from my understanding, fall more in those categories. They would be non-corporeal, spiritual type entities. If my memory's serving right, and I am working completely off memory for that, so I'd have to pull it up to kind of look at it to have any better answer than that.
No, that's fine. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. So in a nutshell, I'm just kind of going back to what we talked about a little bit ago, and that is the details on the Nephilim and why the Nephilim could not and would not. It's not Bigfoot. It's something else. We got the giants, okay, and that's really about the only thing from my perspective that they have in common is they're both tall, but that's it.
Yeah. They're
both tall and they walk on two legs and they got two arms, but kind of the similarities in there. So the details on the Nephilim were, I'm just going to go back and kind of, one of the rabbinical lines of thought is it just simply meant to fall. You'd see one of these things, you'd be terrified, and you would fall. Was that kind of correct? Or
yeah, and I got that. Sanderson quotes that from Aaron in the text, about Nephilim, and uses the verb nophel in Hebrew, which just means fall. And honestly, Nephilim, I think, and I think I've heard Will say something similar to this, is that they're probably not Bigfoot type, entities either. That there's a real probability in my brain that they're probably spiritual beings, because Nephilim could very well be like the fallen angels of the early, they kind of appear before the fall and then really don't show up again, or not before the fall, but before the flood. Sorry. And the idea being that they're like fallen angels who have taken on some kind of form, and it would fit because when you see angels in the Bible of any sort, usually the first thing that happens is people freak out and are scared, because most angels' first appearance and their first words are always "fear not." So
right. That always
if they're
cracks
good
me up.
angels,
Yeah.
So
yeah. Not these cute little cherubs with wings on them.
Yeah, those little baby angel calendars are really not very accurate. But I think the Nephilim, for me, and this is just my opinion, really, I don't have a ton of scholarship to back it up other than what little I've read and seen. And some commentators that I respect that I've read, is the idea that the Nephilim are like the fallen angels who came down and kind of took the advantage of the fall of man to further corrupt the species until the flood. And I'm looking, I do have the chapter 17 kind of on my screen, so I was looking at that because he quotes that same thing too from Genesis 6, where man is multiplying, and the sons of those on high, it actually says, and that's where most people think they're the angels, and they create these, or they are these Nephilim potentially. So
one of the questions I have is you'd mentioned, and don't ask me where, I thought in Genesis it did mention that the Nephilim were before the flood and post-flood, and I think there is one of the lines of thought, there's a couple of lines of thought. One is however they got here in the first place, they did it post-flood. And the other one is that possibly the flood was regionalized, highly real, huge area, obviously, but regionalized, and therefore they could have been outside of the flood area. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, do you think it is possible, or is it in the biblical text that the Nephilim, some of them, they were before the flood, and then it was still a problem to some extent post-flood?
I know they were definitely before the flood, because they are mentioned in Genesis 6 prior to it. It even says, in those days the Nephilim were already in the land, so they were definitely around before the flood. After the flood, it's a question, and I've heard the debates on whether or not the flood was localized or, tradition.
Right. I figured you probably had, right?
Worldwide, yeah. I mean, in my brain, I grew up with the tradition of, it's worldwide. I haven't really seen anything convincing that says, it has to be that, or it has to be only localized.
Right.
It was certainly enough. I do believe, because Scripture says it was enough to destroy, all of the life that was on earth, because God, it said, regretted he'd made man. And the only survivors were those encased in the ark. I do hold to that, because I'm sort of a literalist, but to what extent it was required to make that happen, I don't know. We don't know much about the geography of that time. I mean,
well, that's an interesting point. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
We kind of have an assumption that everything is just as it has been for, however long we go back.
Oh no! Oh no! No.
Maybe not all but there are a lot of people that's just kind of the assumption that whatever it is has been for, as long as it's worth knowing.
Right. Well, take a look at the Black Sea and look at the Mediterranean, and there's some other minor seas in there, and you could easily see where maybe that was an area that had just absolutely got wiped out with the flood. And what we're seeing is post-flood topography being formed, or remnant, or whatever. I'm not, if you look up layperson in the dictionary, there I am. So don't ask me. I don't know. But it's interesting. Yeah, and so that's one of the interesting topics is, and also we're getting a little bit off the Bigfoot subject here, but the Tower of Babel, the whole issue with that, and the separating of people by languages and all that. Was there, I'm curious if you're aware of any, that would be like Mesopotamian lore, or, lore is not the right word, but so is there anything in there that you've heard of ancient Mesopotamian literature that talks about giants?
No, not that I know of. The Tower of Babel is an interesting case in the sense of it's one of those things in the Bible that I am really truly intrigued by, because the underlying principle of it, which is if everybody talks the same language and could all get along, there's literally nothing that could stop, and that's what God says. If these guys all talk the same language and do the same things, nothing's going to stop them. And at that point, confusion laid in, and it's been that way ever since. But I don't have any like real insights on any of the literature from that perspective for Bigfoot. Honestly, I was just really, I think I told you this, Tom, I was really, when I was reading this chapter, and I've been interested as I go along the way, it's kind of like, there are a lot of times I would love to just talk to you guys for like 10 minutes after reading one of these and go, I really want to hear what you think about this, or, that kind of thing. So that's why I'd sent a message this time going, if you guys have a conversation about this, I would love to be in on it, because this is a subject that's a little more near and dear to my heart. But
well, I didn't know that you were interested. So I think, we may have to have some future discussions. I know I would like to, and Will would as well. So that would be, that'd be very interesting. Well, speaking of that, is there anything that you can think of off the top of your head now that you would say, hey, I got you on the phone. Let's, I got a question for you.
I should have saved my list, right? I didn't do that.
Right.
I'm just thinking back through the various chapters and the different times where I would see stuff that, I'm like, I've never really thought of that. I think I've shared this with you before, Tom. We've talked a couple of times that, Sanderson's phrasing and stuff gets me, like it ties me into knots every so often when I'm reading his work, because he has some really long parentheticals and asides. So I hope people who listen can still follow through the whole like maze that is sometimes some of his paragraphs. But just the observations he has about particularly the geography and the climatology of where these things are and why they would be in those areas. I was really intrigued when I was reading the United States one. And there's something to be said for, Sanderson talks about, what's in your own backyard, the stuff that's close to home more. That's another reason why this chapter really stuck out to me. But, the stuff in the United States about the different areas of the United States and where these things could possibly be, because even now, we're 60 years down the road from when Sanderson wrote, but even now there's areas we just don't have a lot of exploration into, and we don't really know what's in there. Like it's not easy to get in there, and if there is anything in there, good luck finding it. That kind of stuff really intrigues me. So I've been really enjoying getting to read this and kind of getting to dig into it a little bit as well. So I appreciate you guys giving me that opportunity.
People don't understand just how big this country is. I remember reading about the Bluff Creek area, for instance. And if you were to drive up there, you would think, oh, yeah, it's a big area, but it wouldn't impress you too much until you find out there's 100,000 square miles in that area. Mm-hmm. And I've been up there many times, and you can be in there 1-2 weeks, never see another soul.
I think it was New Jersey. I saw a statistic about New Jersey that the state of New Jersey was like 63% undeveloped. And that really struck me, because everybody thinks of Jersey as like this just massive city, basically like, well, a lot of the East Coast, we kind of look at it that way. But
especially places like New York. You think New York, it's like, okay, it's this huge population. Well, New York City's on the southern border, isn't it? And
it's kind of the southern southeastern tip, really.
Yeah. So you go north of there to the Adirondack Mountains and places like that, which has a big history of these creatures, lots of activity, and it's a really big, wild area. And you'd never think that about New York. At least I wouldn't.
We went through upstate New York a few years ago on family vacation. We were at Niagara Falls and kind of winding our way down into Pennsylvania, so we drove a lot of back roads. We didn't get on the main highways. And we were driving these 2-lane country roads out in the middle of nowhere. And those areas of New York were just as remote. I mean, there were farms, and we would drive 30 miles between two towns. You just don't think of that when you think of New York. And I'll say this too, there were a lot of like backwater, we talk about hicks in the South, but New York apparently has their own, because we ran into a few of them. We stopped to buy maple syrup, and we ran into one of they wouldn't have been out of place in the deep Ozark Mountains of Arkansas at all. And I mean, just out there in the middle of nowhere, So yeah, there are a lot of just unexplored and unseen places even within our own country.
When you talk about how much information's in Sanderson's book, and for those who haven't read Sanderson's book, it's really true. If I were teaching the subject of Sasquatch in a college, Sanderson's book would be required reading.
Yeah, I absolutely appreciate his attempts, and really he hits the target more than he misses, of trying to be as straightforward, as factual, and as down the line as he can go with it. You really have a hard time sometimes when you're reading and picking up where he's at on a subject, unless he just tells you, because he just kind of reports things.
And some of that too, I think, is because he was a zoologist, so I'm sure some of that plays in there.
Yeah, like when he has an opinion on the creatures, the Brooks, and now I can't think of the other guy's name, but in the Himalayas, the monkeys, because they had tails, when I remember reading that story just as an offhand, as we were trying to test to see if I could do these readings, and then encountering it in the book again, which was kind of interesting, and seeing Sanderson's kind of take on it about, these are probably monkeys of some sort. And I just really appreciate that about him. He'll tell you what he thinks if he knows what he thinks, and if he's kind of unsure, he'll leave it out there and give you as many facts as you can to try and decipher it yourself too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the way it is even with this subject. Sometimes, you have to, in the absence of evidence, you try to piece together what you do know and then come up with some kind of a hypothesis to fill the gap until some information comes that fills that spot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I appreciate that. I think I told Tom early on too, and I've had conversations with some other people, and it's, for me, when you're dealing with people's testimonies, because you go back to, like, the Bible itself is really just about people's testimonies. These are their experiences. You're hearing their stories. This is what we experienced of who God is, and people get bent out of shape because that's supernatural or whatever. But you're still dealing with human testimony, human experience. And if you take one person, like Sanderson says multiple times, it could be a hoax. But if you keep getting the same stories over and over and over again, and with the same thing from different people, often independently, you start having to sit up and pay attention to it and say, well, is there something more behind this, or why is this happening?
And especially at that time period, because there wasn't all the mass information, rapid information transfer that there is today. So
right.
When the early people in the subject would get these stories, and it was usually, throughout time and geography, and you had, like you said, all these matching details, then that's a little bit more than just, people's imaginations at that point.
Exactly.
That was the whole purpose, Will, remember, of Bigfoot in History, is looking back into the past and digging up these repeating patterns.
Demonstrating it, right.
Absolutely. These eyewitness testimonies with people that did not have connections. They didn't have Twitter. They didn't have Facebook. They didn't have any of these mass media. They had, even the newspapers back then really didn't have, I don't know how much sharing of information there was, but you had these repeating patterns. And then you go back further, and then you go back into ancient colonial times. I call it ancient, but the colonial times. And then you go back further into the Native Americans, and the story is the same. Very, very much so.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. And, like you said, there wasn't no cross-contamination. So, when the original people in this started taking a look at it, and I'm sure they were stunned when they started seeing all these similarities by these people who were totally unconnected. They weren't seeing things. And even you and I can relate, when we were kids, in the early 70s. I mean, yeah, there was TV and radio and newspapers, but there still at that time wasn't a lot of this topic out there.
No, there wasn't. And that's the thing that you and I look for quite often with people that we interview and that we talk to, and, just the stories, the accounts that we get, the encounters. You get these nuggets of repeating patterns, and you take it in its totality, really does add up to something.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Jeff, you mentioned, you and I talked a while back on the importance of the rules of evidence. So, for example, and I found this interesting, that in a court of law, science was lower than personal testimony.
Yeah, I've read and studied this a little bit. I use the analogy. I think this is what you're talking about. I shared it with you. I like to use this analogy with people because science can be, for lack of a better word, science can be fooled. Evidence isn't always flawless, and interpreting evidence is certainly not flawless. So I like to use the analogy for this of Lance Armstrong, because most people still know who Lance Armstrong is. According to science, Lance Armstrong is a 5-time Tour de France winner who is clean as the driven snow when it comes to drug use. He passed every drug screening. He never failed a single one. It was only years later that the testimony of his teammates caused him to be stripped of all 5 of his titles. And so testimonially, Lance Armstrong cheated when he raced in the Tour de France. But according to science, he is as clean as can be. And that's a real stark difference between the two worlds of evidence. Science is not as perfect as people want it to be. Testimony is very powerful. And human testimony, especially when it can be corroborated, because it didn't just take one witness to Lance Armstrong to bring him down, it was his whole team. Testimony has a lot of power in transmitting what evidence sometimes can fail to really make the case for.
It's a difficult concept today because you can have the opposite of that too. If there's a lot of people, more, the court of public opinion, so to speak, instead of people actually listening to testimonials and giving them the weight they're due.
Yeah. Well, and we live in a time when a lot of testimonies are getting shut down. Like nobody wants to, listen to something that they don't agree with, and it gets even more difficult. Sanderson talks a lot about throughout the book. He harps on the experts, and he likes to put quotes around it a lot. Because we've seen that even in our world. It's interesting how little things change in 60 years. People are still people. And you have the experts who are invested in trying to lock down their own particular view of something.
Yeah, absolutely.
And who will dismiss out of hand all sorts of evidence brought by other testimony. And even dismiss other real evidence, like physical evidence and things, based on a preconceived notion.
And that holds very true with this topic, because I know Tom and I are dealing with some people right now, so we've shown them a great deal of evidence, of many different kinds. If you're going to have a living creature, it's going to leave these different types of evidence, and we have, really good materials. But people will dismiss it out of hand simply because they don't want to believe it.
Yeah,
they want to fulfill they want to support their narrative, and you get a lot of that. I think when you get somebody who is honestly, we've talked about this, the debunkers versus the skeptics, and for whatever reason, there's a knee-jerk reaction with so many people to just, they got to get their 2 cents in and be a debunker, and they haven't really thought it through.
And a debunker and a skeptic are 2 completely different things. I personally love talking to skeptics because they have great questions. They have great perspective. And skeptics are people, probably 90% of the population. And especially with this topic, and you get a fringe on one side that'll believe anything, and a fringe on the other side that believes nothing. And neither one of those really do a whole lot for me. I'm interested in all the people in between, because they ask hard questions, and it makes you work for good answers.
But they also will seriously consider the answers to those hard questions.
Yes.
A true skeptic will.
That's right.
You may not sway them right away, but they will at least consider that. And whereas the debunkers, you're just pounding your head against the wall. I
always go back when we get on kind of this topic, what Renee DeHinden one of the favorite things he used to say was, he looked at me one time, I asked him something about a PhD, and he says, whenever somebody tells me they have a PhD, I ask them what the prognosis is. And I kind of looked at him quizzically, and I said, what do you mean? He says, he raises his eyebrows, kind of that comical, like, oh, what do you mean? What am I doing wrong look? And he'd say, I thought they told me they had an incurable brain disease, and I wanted to know what the prognosis was.
Yeah. I've said something similar to what you were talking about, Will, too, in that as a pastor, as somebody in that field, I appreciate people who ask questions, particularly people who ask questions that because they're actually looking for information. I can't remember who I heard talk about it. He said that, the old saw that there's no such thing as a dumb question. And he's like, in a sense, that's right. If the question's being asked to gain information, then it's never a dumb question. But if the question's being asked as a got you, I already know the answer, then it's a dumb question.
Right.
And the debunkers are in that second category. They're asking, if they ask questions, they're asking questions because they've already got the answer.
Yeah,
I had somebody approach me a few months ago who, I love these conversations because I've learned how to respond to them over the years of life. But they said, what do you think about, so-and-so topic? And I started and she goes, I said, well, and she goes, I already know, what the answer is, basically. I don't remember how she phrased it. And I was like, oh, interesting. Do you now? And proceeded to launch down a list of questions of my own instead of trying to answer the first question. Because I think asking questions and forcing people to think about the answers is a lot more valuable.
It is.
In every area of life.
It absolutely is. You're correct. Well, Tom?
Well, listen, guys.
Go ahead, Tom.
I just want to say, Jeff, I really appreciate, I was thrilled when you and I talked the other day, and we're going to have you on this show, and I think we're going to have you back on as long as your schedule permits. So before we wrap it up, do you have any questions for either Will or I before we call it a show?
Well, I do want to express my appreciation for you guys letting me come on and just kind of chat with you guys about this particular topic. Because like I said, I like to read the chapters as straight as possible. And I know Tom and I have had a conversation about, there's been a couple of times I've broken down laughing, partly because of his phrasing.
Right.
And the chapter 16 with the scat stuff just about had me. So I told Tom if I ever really wanted to, I could create a blooper reel. Because when I got to the phrase "Shinsi babies," I was on the floor and laughing for about 2 minutes solid. That was just it was so ridiculous and funny at the same time. But there's the random outtakes of things that I mispronounce and realize I've mispronounced and stuff like that would actually make a funny blooper reel. But and I've still got all the raw recordings on top of the ones I send you guys. But yeah, some of this stuff you just you read it and it just hits you funny. And my wife has even commented to me as well. She's like, I don't know how you read that with a straight face. I'm like, it was about the fifth take. That's how I read it with a straight face. So, but I really do. I just wanted to say I appreciate you guys letting me do the narration and have that opportunity, and appreciate you guys letting me come in on a conversation like this just to talk about the book as well.
Well, we certainly appreciate you. Every way we can certainly thank you for coming on with us and doing the midweek show for us. Well, Tom.
By the way,
go ahead, Tom.
I'm going to say one thing real quick, and that is there's a connection between Jeff and Amelia, and Amelia's sister, I believe, Jennifer. We had her on a year and a half ago. Well, she had a sighting in Arkansas, and I think she worked with the DNR or something like that.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So little connection.
That's my sister-in-law.
Sister-in-law. Yeah.
You'd be amazed who you know that's seen something.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, if we don't have anything more, fellas, that'll wrap it up. Everyone, thanks for joining us. Be sure to stay tuned for the midweek show. In Bigfoot History, near Ridgefield, Washington, early July 1963. Mr. and Mrs. Martin Henrich, Portland, fishing on Lewis River, saw what they assumed was a tree trunk near the bank suddenly walk into a thicket. It was beige in color and bigger than a human. Mrs. Henrich told her story to the Oregon Journal, and as a result, Jim Arion, son of Charles Arion, who had a farm nearby, went looking for tracks. He found 16-inch prints leading in and out of the river on the south bank near the railway bridge. I saw some of these when they were several weeks old and made a cast.
Welcome. This story is being brought to you by William Jevning and is being narrated by me, Jim Sower. The Glenn Thomas Story. I was supposed to be watching a cat skinner as he was fire trailing, but it was awful cold, and I walked a mile or so down the trail, because he had no need of anyone at that time, and I thought I'd warm up and see the country. Up where he was, it was cold, and the east wind was blowing. A little further down, it was a west wind coming in. It was late fall, the last week in deer season, I think, in 1967. It was a mountain trail. They have several of them up there, footpaths, and 4 horses, too. The elevation was about between 4,000 and 5,000 feet. I came out lower down, into the fog, before I saw anything, and the fog was freezing on the trees because it was so cold. But if the wind would blow, the fog would break off and fall down, and, well, that made it kind of noisy. It sounded like walking. I came around a bend. Well, first I noticed some rocks that were turned over. All the other rocks were wet because of the fog, but these rocks were dry. Then I looked up, about 40 or 50 feet up on a ridge of rock, and I saw these animals there. Looked like human, or just about. Large male. The female wasn't so large, and a small baby. Well, not really small. It was moving with them. It was standing up, mostly. The 2 older ones were squatting down and, well, sort of bending as they picked up rocks and smelled them. They were kind of careful. They moved on for a few minutes, and then finally the male found possibly what he was looking for and dug real fast down into the rocks, which were large boulders, well, not the round type of rocks, but the flat, sharp kind. I could not explain why these rocks were there. There hadn't been a slide or anything. They were on top of the ridge, so they wouldn't have come down from anywhere. They are loose, quite a few holes underneath them, and they are as if they had been broken up. Definitely not the round river rock type, but they, the animals, would pick them up, and after they smelled them, they would lay them down on top of each other. They didn't just lay them back down where they picked them up. They stacked them up in piles. And when the male found what he was looking for, he really made the rocks fly. The big rocks weighed 50, 60, or even possible 100 pounds. He just jerked them out with his hand. He didn't seem to take any precautions for his safety. Later on I looked, and there was some rock that could have fallen on him, but he wasn't concerned. He brought out what appeared to be a grass nest, possibly some stored hay that small rodents had stored there. He dug through that and brought out the rodents. It seems they ate them. The rodents appeared to be in hibernation or asleep or something. There were about 6 or 8 rodents in the nest. The small animal, I noticed, only got to eat 1, but the others got 2 or 3 apiece. But about that time they became aware of my presence, and, well, just became alert. I was alongside of this trail that follows the ridge. I didn't remember getting there, but I was squatting down beside a small tree when I became aware of where I was. As soon as they realized I was there, they suddenly began to move, real quiet, behind some low-hanging limbs on a tree there. I didn't see them again after that. I tried to follow their tracks in the direction I thought they would have to go, but I couldn't find any, although there was frost there. But the next day I found 2 tracks, one heel print and the front part of the foot, the toes, but they were in a different direction, the direction from which I had come, and I never did get to connect them up with exactly which direction they had gone or know anything about them. The footprints, well, I would say there wasn't enough of the track to tell. They were possibly 5 inches wide. I don't know, at the widest point. I don't think they could have been 6. I didn't know if it was one of the animals I had even seen that had made the footprints. I saw the toe print as it came out of the old landing. I saw the heel print as it went in. The heel print gave me the impression that the heel protruded. The tracks were in dirt. It was just as if you had a level piece and scooped it out for about 2 feet, and it would cave in or something. And the animal had stepped down into that and left a heel print, and as it stepped out on the other side, you could see the toe print. When I left the cat skinner, he was on Low Creek, but I had walked to Jim's Meadows, possibly a mile or more. I saw the footprints between where the cat skinner was and where I had seen the other animals. After the animals disappeared, I watched and looked for a few minutes and then decided I didn't want to go in that direction, so I just headed back. I didn't tell the cat skinner about seeing them. I didn't tell anybody about it until, Bob asked me to ask among my crews. Maybe some of them had seen them. That was the only time I had even mentioned it to any of the fellows out there, because I didn't want anyone to think I was a nut or something or other. The only time I saw their faces was when they became alert. They gave me an impression of having a face a little like a cat, without the ears. I couldn't remember seeing the ears. It seemed like the nose was much flatter. It didn't stick out like a man's. The upper lip was very short and seemed very thin. I couldn't remember that it had a chin like a human has. So, somehow or other, I felt that it was a face more like a cat than a human. The male was darker than the female, dirty brown, where the female was a buckskin or fawn-colored animal. The male had much longer hair on shoulder, head, and neck, and hung in strings, like you see on an Angora goat. He was much heavier in the shoulders than the female. From just above the hips, the male got larger. He had a very wide small of the back. From there on up, he just got bigger and bigger. Then, they had very rounded or stooped shoulders. The head was set lower on the shoulders than on a human. They don't seem to have the neck stand up as we do. Most of the time, they were not standing, but were squatting down, leaning forward to pick up the rocks. I didn't see them stand actually erect until the moment they became alert that I was there. I didn't see them walk, as such. The only movement I saw was when they made a quick, short dash to get behind the limbs of the trees. I saw them move all right, but in a humped-up, stooped-over position, just moving across the rocks. But they were upright when they made that quick dash at the end. It seemed to me that the mother picked up the baby in her lap and ran, holding the baby in front of her, possibly right below the breast, and her breast hung real low, much lower than on a human. I couldn't say how thick through the body these animals were, but they were very heavy set, particularly thick and heavy at the small of the back, and then on up through the ribs. I think the male was over 6 feet tall, but I'm an awful poor judge of height and weight or anything. I didn't think the female was as tall as the male. In fact, I think she came possibly up to his shoulder, but I saw them standing up so little, I didn't know, but they were much larger than a human, much bulkier. The baby didn't come up to the mother's hips, actually. I don't think, but I don't remember for sure. The first time I saw them standing up was as the male stepped out of the hole that he dug with the grass, but it was only a very short while until they took off. I didn't see them after that. Question: How did they eat? Oh, they ate just by taking it in their hand and eating it as one of us would if we were eating a banana. They ate it, skin, feathers, and all, but just bit it in two, and as they would bite part of it, well, then just cram the other right on in. The little one, though, he had a little more difficulty because he couldn't quite have enough room in his mouth for all of it, where the older ones did. It wasn't like a human would hand the food to the baby. He had to get his. He was scratching through the grass that he had got it himself, and the female did the same thing. They gave you the impression in that way of not taking care of the baby, like people would. I've been wondering now if that group lived together as a family, and I hope to go back and look into it deeper. Question: did you form any impression of the proportions of, say, the legs in relation to the rest of the height? Would they be like a long-legged man or short-legged? Oh, I don't know. I couldn't say for sure. But the arms were such that when they squat down, they have to bend forward to pick up anything. Their arms are not long enough to reach. This one that was digging just seemed to go right on down. I didn't remember seeing him get up, but as he was down there, well, he was just digging, and he kept on going down. And, well, at that time, I couldn't exactly see where he was because I was down, and they were up a little bit on the side of the rock, which kind of levels off some. And, well, he went down, and so I couldn't see exactly what he was doing down in there. But I did see when he came out. At that time, I was a little bit nervous, but I'm not sure now. About half of it seemed like a bad dream for a while. I just couldn't believe it. It was really happening. I just couldn't believe, but it is. Question: did you notice the hands at all? I noticed that it had hands. I did not notice if it had thumbs. I couldn't tell from the way it worked. It didn't seem to use the thumb, and I didn't see any ears. I didn't see any knees projecting when it squatted. They were in an awkward position because of the rocks, and they couldn't just squat down like we would on a floor. They would be on different levels and off too far to be comfortable. That's as close as I can explain it. When they went from place to place, they would shift in position according to the terrain. The male, well, actually both of them, seemed to be moving in a certain direction, possibly from tracing the small rodents. I thought possibly it was the scent left by the rodents coming up through the rocks, because it was not a runway that they would have been picking through, because they were just picking up the rocks any place, and as they picked it up, they'd turn it over and smell it, and then they'd lay it on the stack. They left it very definitely in a pile. They would leave anywhere from 3 to 15 or 20 in one pile as they would reach back, and then 6 to 8 feet farther, they'd leave another pile, starting laying them together and in another pile. With Renee and my daughter Catherine and son Jim, I went with this man last July to the spot where he had seen the three creatures. We found the piles of rocks to which he referred, not only at the spot he showed us, but on almost every other area of broken rock we found in 2 hours of scrambling around on the mountain. They were obviously piles manufactured by something or someone. The rock could not have just rested that way naturally. And there were dozens of them. The hole he saw the male Sasquatch dig was about 5 feet deep and almost as steep-sided as a well. No bear or anything else without hands could have lifted out the rocks. A man could undoubtedly figure out a way to do it if he had any reason to take the trouble. But in this case, the story had only come out as a result of an inquiry from someone else who had seen footprints in the snow in January of this year, and there was no reason to expect that anyone would be coming out to look over the site. This ends the story.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning, @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open.